In September of 09 AD, deep in the forests of Germania, 20,000 Roman soldiers walked into a trap. They were the 17th, 18th, and the 19th legions, three of Rome's finest fighting units, veterans of campaigns across the empire. They were accompanied by 6 cohorts of auxiliary troops, 3 squadrons of cavalry, and thousands of camp followers, wives, children, merchants, and slaves. In total, perhaps 25 to 30,000 people stretched in a long, vulnerable column through the dark German woods. They were being led by a man they trusted, a man who had served Rome faithfully for years. A man who held Roman citizenship, wore Roman armor, and spoke Latin as fluently as any senator. His name was Arminius, and he was about to destroy them all. What happened in the Teutoburg Forest over the next 3 days was not just a battle, it was an annihilation. The Roman column was ambushed, surrounded, and systematically slaughtered. Men who had conquered the world died screaming in the mud, cut down by warriors they had trained to fight. Officers were tortured and sacrificed to Germanic gods. The legionary eagles, those sacred standards that represented Rome's honor and power, were captured and carried away into the darkness of the forest. When it was over, 3 legions had ceased to exist. The 17, 18, and 19 would never be reconstituted. Their numbers were retired in shame, never to be used again for the rest of Roman history. The commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, fell on his own sword rather than face capture. His head was sent to Augustus, the Emperor of Rome, the man who had built the empire and believed it invincible. According to ancient sources, Augustus was so shattered by the news that he wandered through his palace for months, banging his head against the walls and crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." The Teutoburg Forest was not the worst defeat in Roman history in terms of numbers. Cannae and Carrhae had been bloodier, but it was perhaps the most consequential. This single battle stopped Roman expansion into Germania forever. It drew a line that would separate the Latin world from the Germanic world for centuries, a line whose echoes can still be traced in the languages and cultures of modern Europe. And it was all the work of one man, a Germanic prince who had been raised as a Roman, educated by Romans, honored by Romans, and who had played the long game of vengeance for his entire adult life. This is the story of Arminius, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, and Rome's worst nightmare made real. To understand how 3 legions could be destroyed by an enemy Rome had spent decades defeating, you need to understand what Germania meant to Rome and what Rome had done to earn Germanic hatred. The Germanic tribes occupied the vast forests and marshlands east of the Rhine River, a territory that stretched from modern Netherlands to Poland, from Scandinavia to the Alps. It was a wild, dark, terrifying landscape by Roman standards. The forests were so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. The winters were brutal, the roads were non-existent, and the people who lived there were considered by Romans to be among the most dangerous barbarians on earth. The Germanic tribes were not a unified nation. They were dozens of separate peoples: Carusi, Chatti, Marsi, Bructeri, Chachi, and many others, each with their own chiefs, their own feuds, their own traditions. They fought among themselves as often as they fought outsiders. They had no cities, no written language, no centralized government, but they had warriors. Tall, strong, fierce warriors who terrified even the battle-hardened legions. Roman writers described Germanic warriors with a mixture of horror and grudging admiration. They fought with long swords and javelins. They charged into battle nearly naked, screaming war cries, apparently indifferent to death. They were individually undisciplined, but collectively overwhelming, capable of swarming positions through sheer ferocity. And they had one advantage that Romans struggled to overcome: they knew the terrain. The forests and swamps of Germania were their home. They could appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish back into the wilderness. They could survive winters that would kill a Roman army. They could fight in conditions where Roman formations were useless. For centuries, the Germanic tribes had been a problem on Rome's northern frontier, raiding across the Rhine, threatening Gaul, occasionally erupting in massive invasions that terrified the civilized world. The most traumatic of these invasions had come at the end of the 2nd century BC, when the Cimbri and Teutonese Germanic and possibly Celtic tribes from the far north had swept down into Roman territory. They had annihilated Roman army after Roman army, killing over 100,000 soldiers in a series of catastrophic battles. For a moment, it had seemed like these barbarians might actually destroy Rome itself. Gaius Marius had finally stopped them, crushing the Teutonese at Aquae Sextiae in 100 BC and the Cimbri at Vercellae in 101 BC. The invasions ended. Rome survived. But the trauma never faded. The Germanic tribes remained, in Roman imagination, an existential threat, savage, unpredictable, and terrifyingly powerful when they united. The Roman response to the Germanic threat was, eventually, to try to conquer them. Julius Caesar had campaigned in Gaul from 58 to 50 BC, bringing all of modern France under Roman control. In the process, he had crossed the Rhine twice, demonstrating Roman power to the Germanic tribes beyond. These expeditions were more symbolic than substantive. Caesar had no intention of permanent conquest east of the Rhine, but they established the river as Rome's frontier. Augustus, Caesar's adopted son and the first Roman emperor, had more ambitious plans. Augustus wanted to push the Roman frontier from the Rhine to the Elbe, roughly 300 miles to the east. This would shorten the empire's northern border significantly, create a more defensible frontier, and incorporate the Germanic tribes into the Roman system or destroy them if they refused. Starting in the 12 BC, Augustus's stepsons, Drusus and Tiberius, launched a series of massive campaigns into Germania. These were not raids but invasions, designed to permanently subjugate the territory and turn it into a Roman province. Drusus was the more aggressive of the two brothers, driving deep into Germanic territory, defeating tribe after tribe, reaching the Elbe itself before his death in 09 BC. According to legend, he saw a vision of a Germanic woman who told him to turn back, that he had gone far enough and would not survive much longer. He fell from his horse and died of his injuries. Tiberius continued the work, though less enthusiastically. By 05 AD, it seemed that Germania was effectively conquered. The tribes had been defeated in battle, many had submitted to Roman authority. Roman camps and roads were being built throughout the territory. Traitors and administrators were moving in. Augustus began treating Germania as a province in all but name. He appointed governors, levied taxes, administered justice. The conquest seemed complete. This was the world into which Arminius was born, a world where Germanic resistance appeared to have been broken and Roman dominion seemed inevitable. Arminius was born around 18 or 17 BC, the son of Segimur, a chief of the Carusi tribe. The Carusi occupied territory in what is now northwestern Germany, between the Weser and Elbe rivers. They were one of the more significant Germanic tribes, and they had initially resisted Roman expansion before eventually submitting. As part of the submission process, a common Roman practice, Segimur was required to send hostages to Rome as guarantees of his tribe's good behavior. The hostages were typically the children of tribal leaders. They would be raised in Rome, educated in Roman ways, and essentially held as insurance against rebellion. Arminius was one of these hostages. He was probably around 8 or 10 years old when he was taken to Rome. For the next decade and more, he lived in the heart of the empire, learning Latin, studying Roman military tactics, absorbing Roman culture. He was trained as a cavalry officer and eventually granted Roman citizenship, a rare honor for a barbarian. He was given the Roman name Arminius, though his Germanic name may have been something like Hermann. He served in the Roman auxiliary cavalry, fighting in Rome's wars, commanding Germanic troops in the service of the empire. By all external appearances, he was a perfect example of Roman assimilation. a barbarian prince who had been civilized, educated, and integrated into the Roman system. The kind of success story that justified Roman imperialism, proof that even the wildest savages could be turned into useful subjects. The Romans trusted him completely. They had no idea what was growing in his heart. We don't know exactly when Arminius decided to betray Rome. We don't know if there was a single moment of decision or a gradual accumulation of resentment. What we do know is that by 09 AD, when he was in his mid-20s, Arminius was serving as a commander of Germanic auxiliary troops attached to the Roman forces in Germania. He had returned to his homeland, presumably to help pacify it, and had quickly become a trusted advisor to the Roman governor. That governor was Publius Quinctilius Varus. Varus was exactly the wrong man for the job. He came from one of Rome's oldest and most distinguished families. He had married Augustus's grandniece, making him part of the imperial family by marriage. He had served as governor of Syria, where he had earned a reputation for both brutality and corruption, reportedly arriving in Syria rich and leaving it poor, while the province did the opposite. Syria, however, was a long pacified territory with established cities and sophisticated administrative structures. Germania was something else entirely. Varus treated Germania like it was already a stable Roman province. He introduced Roman law, Roman taxation, Roman judicial procedures. He sat in judgment over Germanic disputes, applying Roman legal concepts that made no sense in a tribal context. He levied taxes and demanded tribute with the same heavy-handedness he had used in Syria. The Germanic tribes seethed. They had submitted to Roman military power, but they had not agreed to become Roman subjects. They had not agreed to pay taxes to support an empire that held them in contempt. They had not agreed to have their disputes settled by a foreign official according to foreign laws. Varus saw pacified subjects. The Germans saw unbearable oppression. Arminius saw opportunity. Arminius began building a conspiracy. Using his position as a Roman officer and his status as a Germanic prince, he traveled between the tribes, meeting with chiefs, building alliances, stoking resentment. He had unique credibility. He knew the Romans intimately, understood their tactics, and could explain exactly how they could be defeated. His plan was simple but audacious. He would lure the Roman army into terrain where its advantages were neutralized, then crush it with an overwhelming surprise attack. The key was to gather enough tribes together, maintain secrecy until the trap was sprung, and choose ground where Roman discipline and equipment meant nothing. The Teutoburg Forest was perfect. Modern archaeology has identified the likely site of the battle near the town of Calcries in Lower Saxony. The terrain there creates a natural killing ground, a narrow corridor between a forested hill and a great bog where a large army would be forced to string out into a long, vulnerable column. Arminius knew this ground. He had grown up not far from here. He understood exactly how to use it, but the conspiracy nearly failed before it started. Arminius's own father-in-law, a chief named Segestes, discovered the plot and warned Varus. Segestes had his own reasons for opposing Arminius. The two men were personal enemies. Arminius had apparently eloped with Segestes' daughter, the Snelda, against her father's wishes. The family feud was intense and bitter. Segestes went to Varus and laid out the entire conspiracy. He named Arminius as the leader. He described the planned ambush. He begged Varus to arrest the conspirators immediately while they were still in the Roman camp. Varus refused to believe him. From Varus's perspective, the warning made no sense. Arminius was a Roman citizen, a Roman officer, a man who had served Rome faithfully for years. Segestes was obviously biased. Everyone knew about the feud with Arminius. The accusation looked like a personal vendetta dressed up as a security concern. Besides, the Germania that Varus saw was peaceful. The tribes were quiet. There had been no significant resistance for years. The idea that they were secretly planning a massive uprising, led by one of Rome's own officers, seemed absurd. Varus dismissed the warning and continued trusting Arminius. It was probably the worst decision any Roman commander ever made. In September of 09 AD, Varus was preparing to move his army from its summer camp to winter quarters on the Rhine. This was a routine operation. Roman armies in frontier zones typically established forward camps during the campaign season and withdrew to more secure bases during winter. The march back to the Rhine would take several days through territory that Varus considered pacified. At the last moment, Arminius brought urgent news. A small tribe some distance to the north had risen in rebellion. It was a minor matter, easily handled, but it would require a detour to suppress. Varus agreed to take the army on this detour. Arminius would guide them. What Varus didn't know was that there was no rebellion. It was a fiction designed to lead the Roman column away from the safe routes and into the prepared killing ground. On the march, Arminius and his Germanic auxiliaries rode ahead, supposedly to scout the route and gather tribal allies for the Roman cause. In fact, they were joining the ambush force, preparing to attack the army they had just left. The Roman column stretched for miles. 3 legions, plus auxiliaries, plus the baggage train, plus the camp followers, perhaps 25,000 people in total. In enemy territory, such a column should have maintained tight formation, with scouts ranging ahead and flanking guards protecting the sides. But Varus didn't think he was in enemy territory. He thought he was marching through a pacified province. The column was loose, disorganized, strung out along the forest paths. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The first attacks came on the second day of the march. The Roman column was passing through a narrow defile, the corridor between the forest and the bog that Arminius had chosen for the ambush. The weather was terrible. Heavy rain had turned the ground to mud. The trees crowded close on one side, the marsh stretched impassably on the other. Suddenly, Germanic warriors emerged from the forest. They didn't charge in mass, the way Romans expected barbarians to fight. They struck and faded, using the trees for cover, targeting exposed sections of the column. Javelins flew out of the darkness. Men fell. The column lurched to a halt, trying to form up, but there was no room. The terrain was too narrow, the attackers too dispersed. Roman training was designed for open field battle, where disciplined formations could anchor a line and grind down the enemy. Here, in the forest, in the rain, spread across miles of muddy track, that training was useless. The Germans kept attacking, kept withdrawing, kept probing for weak points. They knew the Romans were exhausted, confused, unable to bring their strength to bear. They had all the time in the world. Night fell. The Romans tried to make camp, but the attacks continued. Men died in the darkness, picked off by enemies they couldn't see. The second day was worse. The Romans abandoned most of their baggage, the wagons, the supplies, everything that was slowing them down, and tried to fight their way forward. But forward led deeper into the killing ground. The attacks intensified. The Germans had been gathering strength all night, and now more and more warriors were joining the assault. Arminius was coordinating them brilliantly, directing attacks at the weakest points, preventing the Romans from ever consolidating their forces. Some Roman units tried to break out. A cavalry squadron made a desperate charge, hoping to punch through the Germanic lines and escape. They were surrounded and annihilated. The legionary commander Mnemonius Valla took the remaining cavalry and fled, abandoning the infantry to their fate. He didn't make it far. The Germans caught up with him and killed every rider. By the end of the second day, the Roman army was disintegrating. Units had lost contact with each other. Officers were dead or missing. The wounded were being left behind. Discipline was collapsing, and the Germans kept coming. Heaved before, he had destroyed a Roman army. On the third day, it ended. The remnants of the Roman army made a final stand, or perhaps it was less a stand than a slaughter. The sources are fragmentary, and the exact sequence of events is unclear. What's certain is that by the end of that day, the 17, 18, and 19 legions had ceased to exist. The killing was comprehensive and brutal. Roman officers were given special treatment. Some were sacrificed to Germanic gods, their blood offered on woodland altars. Some were tortured before being killed. Some were buried alive. The Germans understood that these men represented Roman authority, and they wanted that authority to suffer before it died. Varus, seeing that all is lost, fell on his own sword. It was the traditional Roman response to hopeless defeat, better suicide than the humiliation of capture. Some of his officers followed his example. Others tried to surrender. The Germans were not particularly interested in prisoners. The common soldiers died where they stood, or where they ran, or where they were hunted down in the forest. Some were killed immediately. Others were enslaved. Though Germanic society had less use for slaves than Rome did, and many captives were eventually sacrificed or killed. When it was over, the forest floor was carpeted with Roman dead, 20,000 men, perhaps more. The greatest single-day disaster for Roman arms since Cannae, 2 centuries earlier. The eagles were taken. These sacred standards, which embodied the honor of the legions, were carried off as trophies. For Rome, losing the eagles was almost worse than losing the men. It was a spiritual catastrophe, a stain on Roman honor that demanded vengeance. Arminius had achieved what no Germanic leader had achieved before. He had destroyed a Roman army. When news of the disaster reached Rome, the city went into a panic. 3 legions destroyed, 20,000 dead, the eagles captured, the governor killed. It was the kind of catastrophe that Romans associated with the darkest moments of their history, with Cannae, with the Gallic sack of Rome, with the moments when the Republic had nearly perished. And Germania was not far away. The Rhine frontier was suddenly exposed. If the Germanic tribes followed up their victory with a massive invasion, if they crossed the river and swept into Gaul, there was little to stop them. The legions on the Rhine were now the front line, and they had just seen what the Germans could do. Augustus was 71 years old when he received word of the Teutoburg disaster. He had spent his entire adult life building the Roman Empire, transforming a war-torn republic into a stable monarchy, extending Roman power to its greatest extent in history. He had believed that Germania was nearly pacified, that the empire's frontiers were secure, that his life's work was complete. Now, in what should have been the twilight of his reign, everything seemed to be collapsing. The ancient historian Suetonius describes Augustus's reaction in vivid terms. The emperor was so shattered that he let his beard and hair grow for months, a sign of mourning in Roman culture. He beat his head against the doors of his palace. He cried out in anguish, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." For years afterward, he reportedly treated the anniversary of the disaster as a day of mourning, refusing to conduct normal business, lost in grief and possibly guilt. Augustus had appointed Varus. Augustus had pushed for the conquest of Germania. Augustus had underestimated the threat. The blood of 20,000 men was, in some sense, on his hands. The immediate Roman response was defensive. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and designated heir, rushed to the Rhine with reinforcements. His mission was to stabilize the frontier, prevent any Germanic invasion of Gaul, and restore Roman morale. He found the Rhine legions in a state of shock and fear. Rumors were flying that Arminius was marching on the river with a vast Germanic host. Soldiers were terrified that they would suffer the same fate as Varus's army. Discipline was wavering. Tiberius restored order through a combination of firm leadership and cautious strategy. He strengthened the Rhine defenses, conducted limited punitive raids across the river, and demonstrated that Rome was still powerful and still dangerous. But he did not attempt to reconquer the lost territory. The priority was survival, not expansion. The Germanic tribes, meanwhile, did not follow up their victory with a major invasion. This may seem surprising. Surely this was their moment, when Roman power was at its weakest, but it reflects the fundamental nature of Germanic society. The tribes had united temporarily under Arminius's leadership to destroy Varus, but they had no permanent political structure, no unified command, no ability to sustain a prolonged campaign far from home. Once the immediate threat was eliminated, the coalition began to fragment. Chiefs returned to their own territories, warriors went home to their families and farms. Arminius was a brilliant tactician, but he was not a king. He couldn't compel obedience. He couldn't prevent the alliance from dissolving. The same decentralization that had made the Germanic tribes so hard to conquer also prevented them from exploiting their victory. The moment passed, the Rhine held, Rome survived. But Rome could not simply accept the disaster and move on. The loss of the eagles was an unbearable humiliation. As long as those standards remained in Germanic hands, Roman honor was stained. Every year that passed without recovering them was a reminder that Rome had been defeated, that Rome's power had limits, that barbarians had triumphed over the legions. More practically, the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine now knew that Rome could be beaten. If the defeat went unavenged, it would encourage resistance everywhere, not just in Germania, but across the empire. Subject peoples would see that defiance was possible. The mystique of Roman invincibility would be shattered. Augustus understood this, even in his grief. Before his death in 14 AD, he began planning a campaign of vengeance. He designated his grandson Germanicus, the son of the beloved Drusus, the young prince who embodied Roman martial virtue, as the commander who would restore Roman honor. Germanicus was everything a Roman general was supposed to be. He was young, handsome, charismatic, and genuinely beloved by the soldiers. He was married to Agrippina, Augustus's granddaughter, and had several children, creating a picture of perfect Roman domesticity combined with military prowess. He was also determined to avenge Teutoburg. When Augustus died in August of 14 AD, Tiberius became emperor. Tiberius was a complicated man, competent, experienced, but cold and suspicious. He lacked Augustus's political gifts and popular touch. He had been passed over multiple times in the succession before finally being adopted as Augustus's heir, and he carried deep resentments that colored his entire reign. His relationship with Germanicus was particularly fraught. Germanicus was popular in a way Tiberius would never be. The soldiers adored him. The people adored him. He represented everything bright and hopeful about the imperial family, while Tiberius represented the darker aspects of power. Tiberius supported the Germanic campaign. He had no choice, really, given the political situation, but he watched Germanicus's growing popularity with barely concealed jealousy. In 14 AD, Germanicus took command of the Rhine legions and began preparing for the reconquest of Germania. His first challenge was a mutiny. The Rhine legions had been promised bonuses and discharges that had never materialized. They were overworked, underpaid, and frustrated. When they heard of Augustus's death, when the transition to a new emperor created uncertainty about who was really in charge, they exploded. The mutiny was ugly. Soldiers attacked their officers. Centurions were beaten and killed. The camps descended into chaos. For a moment, it seemed like the entire Rhine frontier might collapse into anarchy. Germanicus handled the crisis with a combination of personal courage and theatrical brilliance. He went among the mutinous soldiers, alone and unarmed, appealing to their honor and their loyalty. When they threatened him, he drew his sword and placed it at his own throat, declaring that he would rather die than see Roman soldiers disgrace themselves. When some soldiers mockingly offered him their own swords, others intervened to stop the suicide. According to ancient sources, Germanicus brought his wife Agrippina and their infant son Gaius, the future Emperor Caligula, to the camp. The sight of the general's pregnant wife and small child being sent away for their safety, fleeing from Roman soldiers, shamed the legions into submission. The mutiny collapsed. Discipline was restored. and Germanicus turned his attention to vengeance. The Germanic campaigns of 14 to 16 AD were some of the most dramatic military operations in Roman history. Germanicus launched multiple invasions across the Rhine, driving deep into Germanic territory. His objectives were clear: devastate the tribes that had participated in the Teutoburg massacre, recover the lost eagles, and visit the site of the disaster to honor the Roman dead. The campaigns were brutal. Germanicus made no distinction between warriors and civilians. Villages were burned, populations were slaughtered or enslaved. The goal was not just military victory, but psychological terror to make the Germans understand that resistance to Rome meant annihilation. The Marsi tribe, one of the groups that had participated in the ambush, was attacked during a festival when the warriors were drunk and unprepared. Germanicus's legions killed everyone they could find: men, women, children, the elderly. Temples were destroyed, sacred groves were burned. Other tribes suffered similar treatment. The Romans swept through the forest lands, leaving devastation behind them. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. Germanicus wasn't trying to occupy the territory, but rather punishment on a massive scale. Throughout these campaigns, Arminius remained Germanicus's primary target. The two men were roughly the same age, both military commanders of exceptional ability, and their conflict took on an intensely personal dimension. Arminius tried to repeat his Teutoburg success, luring Roman forces into ambushes, using the terrain to neutralize Roman advantages. Sometimes it worked. In one engagement, Roman cavalry was trapped and nearly destroyed before infantry reinforcements arrived. In another, Germanicus himself was nearly captured when Germanic warriors swarmed his position. But Germanicus had learned from Varus's mistakes. He kept his forces concentrated. He used his fleet to move troops along the rivers, avoiding the forest trails. He established fortified camps and refused to be drawn into unfavorable terrain. And he had something Varus had lacked: overwhelming force. 8 legions, over 40,000 soldiers, plus cavalry and auxiliaries. The largest Roman army assembled in Germania since the original conquest attempt. In 15 AD, Germanicus achieved one of his primary objectives. He found the site of the Teutoburg disaster. The Roman column approached the battlefield 6 years after the massacre. The forest had reclaimed much of the ground, but the evidence of catastrophe was everywhere. The ancient historian Tacitus describes the scene in haunting detail. In the middle of the plain, whitening bones lay scattered or piled in heaps as men had fled or stood their ground. Nearby lay fragments of weapons and the limbs of horses, while human skulls were nailed to tree trunks. In the nearby groves were the barbarous altars where the tribunes and senior centurions had been sacrificed. The soldiers found the remains of their comrades' bones picked clean by animals and weather scattered across miles of forest floor. They found the remnants of the Roman camp, the earthworks where Varus had tried to make a final stand. They found the trees where captured officers had been tortured and killed. It was a scene of horror even after 6 years. The soldiers wandered through the battlefield, trying to identify the remains of friends and relatives. They collected bones without knowing whose they were, without any way of knowing, and began building burial mounds. Germanicus himself placed the first piece of turf on the burial mound, honoring the dead and sharing in his soldiers' grief. It was a powerful moment, a gesture of respect that bound the army together in their mission of vengeance. But Tiberius, back in Rome, was not pleased. The emperor criticized Germanicus for the burial operation. Touching the remains of the dead, he said, was religiously polluting for a man holding military command and priestly office. This may have been genuine religious concern, or it may have been jealousy, Tiberius looking for any excuse to diminish Germanicus's glory. The relationship between emperor and general was growing increasingly strained. The campaigns continued through 15 and 16 AD with mixed results. Germanicus won significant victories in open battle. At Idistaviso, near the Weser River, he caught Arminius's confederation in relatively open terrain and demonstrated what Roman legions could do when they could actually deploy properly. The Germanic warriors were slaughtered. Arminius himself was wounded and barely escaped. But Germanicus also suffered setbacks. On the return march from one campaign, his fleet was caught in a storm in the North Sea, ships were wrecked. Thousands of soldiers drowned, horses, equipment, and supplies were lost. It was a disaster that nearly negated the victories on land. And despite all his efforts, Germanicus could not catch Arminius. The Germanic leader was always one step ahead, fading into the forests, regrouping, returning to fight again. The war became a frustrating chase through endless woodland, where every Roman advance seemed to melt away like morning mist. The eagles, at least, were gradually recovered. The first eagle from the 19th Legion was recaptured in 15 AD from the Bructeri tribe. Germanicus discovered that the standard was being held in a sacred grove, and he launched a raid specifically to retrieve it. The second eagle from the 18th Legion was recovered in 16 AD from the Marsi. The third eagle from the 17th Legion would not be found until 41 AD, during the reign of Claudius, when it was finally retrieved from the Chachi. For Rome, recovering the eagles was symbolically crucial. Each retrieval was celebrated, announced to the people, treated as a victory in itself. The standards were returned to Rome with great ceremony and placed in the temple of Mars Ultermars, the Avenger built by Augustus specifically to house recovered military symbols. But symbols weren't the same as victory. And victory, in any meaningful sense, remained elusive. In 16 AD, Tiberius ordered Germanicus to end the Germanic campaigns and return to Rome. The official reasons were sensible enough. The campaigns were expensive. The losses, particularly from the naval disaster, were significant. The strategic gains were minimal. Germania remained unconquered. Arminius remained at large, and there was no clear path to permanent victory. Tiberius argued that it was better to let the Germanic tribes destroy each other through internal conflict than to keep pouring Roman blood and treasure into an endless forest war. Time and patience would accomplish what military force could not. This was probably true, but Germanicus was frustrated. He believed he was close to final victory, that one more campaign would break Germanic resistance forever. He wanted to finish what he had started. Tiberius didn't care what Germanicus wanted. The young general was recalled to Rome, awarded a triumph, the highest military honor, and then sent to the eastern provinces, far from the Rhine and the glory of the Germanic wars. He would never return to Germania. In 19 AD, Germanicus died in Antioch, Syria, apparently from poison. Whether he was actually murdered, and if so, by whom, remains one of the great mysteries of Roman history. Many Romans believed Tiberius was responsible, either directly or through agents. The emperor's jealousy of his popular nephew was well known. The timing was suspicious. Whatever the truth, Germanicus's death ended any realistic hope of resuming the Germanic conquest. He had been the driving force behind the campaigns, the inspiration for the troops, the symbol of Roman vengeance. Without him, there was no one with the political standing and military credibility to advocate for continuing the war. The Rhine remained the frontier. Germania remained free. What happened to Arminius? His fate after the Roman withdrawal was, in its way, as tragic as Germanicus's. Arminius had achieved something remarkable. He had united the Germanic tribes, defeated a Roman army, and prevented the conquest of his homeland. He was, for a brief moment, the most powerful man in Germania, but he couldn't hold on to that power. The Germanic chiefs who had followed him against Rome had no intention of following him in peacetime. They were independent warriors, each jealous of his own authority, unwilling to submit to any king. When Arminius began acting like a monarch, when he tried to consolidate power and establish himself as the permanent leader of a Germanic confederation, they turned against him. His own relatives were among his enemies. Segestes, his father-in-law, had always opposed him. Other chiefs saw Arminius's ambition as a threat to their own positions. The very independence that had made the Germanic tribes so hard for Rome to conquer now made them impossible for Arminius to rule. In 21 AD, 12 years after his great victory, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own family. He was about 37 years old. Tacitus, writing a century later, offered an epitaph. He was unmistakably the liberator of Germania, one who challenged Rome not in its infancy, like other kings and commanders, but at the height of its power. In battle he was not always successful, but in war he was never conquered. He lived 37 years and held power for 12. To this day he is sung of among the barbarian tribes. It was a generous assessment from a Roman historian. Tacitus recognized that Arminius had done something no one else had managed. He had stopped Roman expansion permanently at the height of Roman power. But the liberation Arminius achieved was also his curse. A free Germania had no place for a king. The decision to abandon the conquest of Germania was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential in Roman history. It wasn't inevitable. Rome had the military capability to continue the campaigns. The losses at Teutoburg, while devastating, were not unrecoverable. Rome had suffered worse and continued fighting. If Germanicus had been given another few years, if Tiberius had been more supportive, if political factors had aligned differently, the outcome might have been different. But Tiberius made a strategic calculation that would echo through the centuries. The cost of conquering and holding Germania, he concluded, outweighed the benefits. The territory was poor, the terrain was impossible, and the population was too hostile. Better to let the Rhine serve as the frontier and invest Roman resources elsewhere. This was a defensible decision. It may even have been the right one. But it meant that Rome's expansion in the north was over. The line that divided the Roman world from the Germanic world was fixed. That line would shape European history for the next 2,000 years. The Rhine River became Rome's permanent northern frontier in Europe. It would remain so for centuries, through the height of the empire and into its slow decline. Roman legions would patrol its banks, Roman forts would dot its length, Roman civilization would flourish on its western shore. And on the eastern side, the Germanic tribes would remain free and conquered, unassimilated, forever beyond the reach of Roman law and Roman culture. This was not the original plan. Augustus had envisioned a frontier on the Elbe, 300 miles further east. That frontier would have been shorter, more defensible, and would have incorporated millions of Germanic people into the Roman system. It would have created a very different Europe. Instead, the Teutoburg disaster drew a line that would persist for millennia. Consider the consequences. The Rhine frontier divided Europe into two cultural zones that would evolve along very different paths. To the west and south lay the Roman world, Latin-speaking, Christian eventually, heir to Mediterranean civilization. To the east and north lay the Germanic world, speaking Germanic languages, developing its own traditions, connected to Rome by trade and war, but never by integration. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century AD, it was Germanic tribes who delivered the final blows and who established successor kingdoms on Roman territory. But these were not the same as a Germania that had been Romanized for centuries. The Franks, Visigoths, Vandals, and others who inherited the Western Empire brought their own traditions, their own languages, their own social structures. The Europe that emerged from the fall of Rome was a hybrid Roman and Germanic elements combined in complex ways. But the fundamental division between the Romance-speaking regions, where Latin evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, and the Germanic-speaking regions where German, Dutch, English, and Scandinavian languages developed, can be traced directly to that line on the Rhine. Arminius's victory didn't just save Germanic independence for his own generation. It preserved a distinct cultural identity that would shape the modern world. The Romans, of course, never forgot Teutoburg. The disaster remained a traumatic memory throughout Roman history. The numbers of the destroyed legions 17, 18, 19 were never used again. This was highly unusual. Roman legions were regularly destroyed and reconstituted, keeping their original numbers as a point of pride and continuity. But these 3 numbers were cursed, associated with such catastrophic shame that no emperor would revive them. Roman writers returned to the Teutoburg disaster again and again, trying to understand what had gone wrong, trying to extract lessons from the catastrophe. The historian Tacitus, writing about a century after the battle, devoted extensive passages to the Germanic wars and to Arminius himself. His account is our primary source for much of what we know about these events. Tacitus was ambivalent about both sides. He admired Germanic virtue, their courage, their independence, their rejection of the luxury and corruption that he believed was weakening Rome, but he also recognized the brutality of Germanic society and the threat it posed to civilization. His portrait of Arminius is particularly complex. Tacitus acknowledged Arminius as a great man, a liberator, someone who had challenged Rome at the peak of its power and won. But he also noted that Arminius died by treachery, killed by his own people, unable to create anything lasting from his victory. There's a lesson in that, Tacitus seemed to suggest. Germanic freedom was real, but it came at a cost. A society that could not accept leadership, that tore down any man who rose to high, was ultimately limited in what it could achieve. Rome, for all its flaws, had built an empire. Germania had produced a hero and then murdered him. The frontier on the Rhine was not entirely static. Over the centuries, Rome made limited advances beyond the river. The Agra decumates a wedge of territory between the Upper Rhine and Upper Danube was occupied and settled. A limes, or fortified frontier line, was constructed, pushing the boundary slightly eastward in some regions. Roman trade penetrated deep into Germania. Roman goods, wine, pottery, jewelry, weapons flowed across the frontier in exchange for amber, furs, and slaves. Roman influence shaped Germanic society in subtle ways, spreading knowledge of Roman military techniques, Roman craftsmanship, Roman ideas. Germanic warriors served in the Roman auxiliaries, as Arminius himself had done. Over the centuries, more and more Germans entered Roman service, until by the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman army was largely staffed and led by men of Germanic origin. The line between Roman and German became increasingly blurred, but political control, direct Roman rule over the Germanic heartland, was never achieved. The Teutoburg disaster had established a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. Roman emperors who dreamed of Eastern conquest against Parthia and Persia rarely thought seriously about resuming the Germanic wars. The one significant exception was the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 AD. Marcus Aurelius spent the last decade of his reign fighting the Marcomannic Wars, a desperate struggle against Germanic and other tribes along the Danube frontier. These were not wars of conquest, but wars of survival. The tribes were invading Roman territory, threatening the provinces, testing Roman defenses. Marcus defeated the invaders eventually, but the wars consumed his reign and his health. He died at Vindobona, modern Vienna, in 180 AD, still on campaign, having spent years in the field that he would have preferred to spend studying philosophy. Some evidence suggests that Marcus intended to create new provinces beyond the Danube to push the frontier northward as Augustus had once planned to push it eastward. If so, his death ended those plans. His son Commodus, who succeeded him, had no interest in frontier wars and quickly made peace. The opportunity, if it ever existed, was lost. The long-term military relationship between Rome and the Germanic tribes followed a consistent pattern: raiding, punitive expeditions, temporary settlements, and renewed conflict. Germanic tribes would cross the frontier sometimes in small raiding parties. sometimes in massive invasions seeking plunder, land, or refuge from pressures further east. Roman forces would respond, pushing the invaders back, sometimes pursuing them across the river, inflicting devastating punishment. But Rome never attempted to permanently occupy the Germanic lands again. The memory of Teutoburg was too strong, the logistical challenges too daunting, the strategic payoff too uncertain. Instead, Rome developed increasingly sophisticated methods of managing the Germanic threat without direct conquest. Diplomacy became a key tool. Roman emperors cultivated friendly relationships with certain Germanic chiefs, providing subsidies, gifts, and political support in exchange for peace on the frontier. They played tribes against each other, encouraging internal conflicts that prevented any unified Germanic threat from emerging. This strategy was often effective, but it had long-term costs. The subsidies drained Roman resources. The Germanic leaders who received Roman support became increasingly powerful, building military capabilities with Roman money that could eventually be turned against Rome. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the relationship had become deeply dysfunctional. Germanic leaders held high positions in the Roman military. Germanic tribes had been settled on Roman territory as foederati-allied forces who provided military service in exchange for land. The distinction between Roman and German had become almost meaningless at the elite level. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, it was not through dramatic conquest by foreign invaders. It was through a gradual process in which Germanic leaders who were already embedded in the Roman system simply stopped pretending to serve Roman emperors and started ruling in their own names. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman army. It was less a conquest than a change in management. What would have happened if Varus had won at Teutoburg? This is one of the great counterfactual questions of ancient history, and historians have debated it for centuries. If Arminius's conspiracy had failed if Varus had heeded Segist's warning, or if the ambush had been defeated, Roman conquest of Germania might have proceeded. The territory might have been pacified over the following decades, as Gaul had been pacified after Caesar's conquest. Germanic tribes might have been Romanized, learning Latin, adopting Roman customs, integrating into the imperial system. In this scenario, there would be no distinct Germanic cultural zone in Europe. The languages we now call German, Dutch, English, and Scandinavian might never have developed or might have developed as variants of Latin, like French and Spanish. The entire history of medieval and modern Europe would be different. Christianity might have spread differently. The political structures of medieval Europe might have evolved differently. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of the nation-state, all of these developments were shaped by the Roman-Germanic divide that Teutoburg established. Some historians argue that this counterfactual is implausible. Germania, they suggest, was simply too large, too poor, and too hostile to be permanently conquered. Even if Varus had survived, even if Germanicus had continued his campaigns, the ultimate result would have been the same: Roman withdrawal and a frontier on the Rhine. Others argue that Roman persistence could have overcome these obstacles. Rome had conquered equally difficult territories before. Given enough time and resources, Germania might have been pacified. We'll never know. Arminius made his choice, sprung his trap, and changed history. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was rediscovered in a different sense during the modern era. For centuries, the exact site of the battle was unknown. Roman sources described a forest, a bog, a massacre, but they didn't provide precise geographical coordinates. Various locations were proposed, debated, and rejected. Then, in the late 20th century, a British amateur archaeologist named Tony Clun began searching near the town of Calcrease in Lower Saxony. Using a metal detector, he found Roman coins, then more coins, then military equipment sling bullets, arrowheads, fragments of armor. Professional excavations followed, and they confirmed that Calcrease was almost certainly the site of the battle, or at least a major part of it. The discoveries were remarkable. Archaeologists found the remains of a Germanic wall and earthwork constructed specifically for the ambush, designed to channel the Roman column into a killing zone. They found the bones of men and horses. They found personal items dropped by fleeing soldiers. They found a Roman officer's face mask, a haunting artifact that put a human face on the disaster. The site is now an archaeological park and museum, where visitors can walk the ground where 20,000 Romans died. The discoveries have added enormously to our understanding of the battle, confirming some aspects of the ancient accounts while revealing details that no written source preserved. Arminius himself experienced a strange afterlife in European memory. For the Romans, he was a traitor and a murderer, a man who had violated the trust placed in him and slaughtered his former comrades. Roman sources acknowledge his abilities, but they never forgive his betrayal. For later Germans, he became something very different, a national hero, a symbol of Germanic resistance to foreign domination, a figure whose victory proved that Germans were unconquerable. This transformation began during the Renaissance, when German humanists rediscovered Tacitus's accounts and began celebrating Arminius as a founder of German national identity. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, praised Arminius as a hero. Poets and artists depicted his victory over the Romans as a formative moment in German history. In the 19th century, as German nationalism grew more intense, Arminius became a central figure in the national mythology. He was renamed Hermann, the German Arminius being a Latinized version of a Germanic name, possibly Hermann or Armin. His victory was celebrated as proof of German martial prowess and love of freedom. In 1875, a massive monument was erected near Detmold in the region where the battle was once thought to have occurred. The Hermannsdenkmal Hermanns monument stands over 50 meters tall, depicting Arminius raising his sword in triumph. It was one of the largest statues in the world at the time of its construction. The monument reflected the nationalism of the newly unified German Empire, and it carried darker implications as well. The celebration of Germanic victory over Rome fed into ideas of German racial superiority that would have catastrophic consequences in the 20th century. The Nazis, not surprisingly, embraced Arminius as an Aryan hero. This association has complicated Arminius's legacy in modern Germany. The monument still stands, but it's now interpreted more cautiously. Arminius is acknowledged as a historical figure of significance, but the nationalist mythology that grew up around him is recognized as dangerous. The real Arminius, as opposed to the symbol, was neither a German nationalist, no such thing existed in his time, nor a proto-Nazi. He was a tribal leader pursuing the interests of his people as he understood them, operating in a political context utterly different from anything in modern experience. But that's how historical memory works. Figures from the past are constantly reinterpreted to serve the needs of the present. Arminius has been many things to many people over the past millennia. Let me step back and consider what the Teutoburg disaster reveals about the nature of empires. Rome was the most successful empire in Western history. It lasted, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. It conquered the entire Mediterranean world and large portions of Western Europe. It created a civilization whose influence is still felt today in our languages, our laws, our architecture, our political ideas. And yet, even at the height of its power, Rome could not conquer everyone. The Germanic tribes were not more powerful than Rome. They were not better organized, better equipped, or better led, with the exception of Arminius, briefly. By any objective measure, Rome should have been able to defeat them. But the Germans had advantages that Rome could not overcome. They had terrain. The forests and swamps of Germania negated Roman tactical advantages and created endless opportunities for ambush and guerrilla warfare. They had resilience. Germanic society was decentralized, which meant that there was no single point of failure. You could defeat a tribe, kill its leaders, burn its villages, and another tribe would emerge, or the same tribe would regenerate, and the resistance would continue. They had home field advantage. The Germans were fighting for their land, their families, their way of life. They knew the territory intimately and could survive conditions that would kill a Roman army. And they had patience. Rome needed quick victories that could be converted into stable provinces generating tax revenue. The Germans just needed to keep fighting year after year, decade after decade, until Rome decided the cost wasn't worth it. This pattern of powerful empire failing to conquer a less powerful but more resilient opponent has repeated throughout history. The British in Afghanistan, the Americans in Vietnam, the Soviets also in Afghanistan. The dynamics are different in each case, but the underlying lesson is similar. Military superiority is not the same as the ability to conquer. Winning battles is not the same as winning wars. And some places, some peoples, some situations are simply beyond the reach of imperial power, no matter how great that power appears to be. There's one more dimension of the Teutoburg story worth considering: the role of individuals. History is shaped by vast impersonal forces: economics, geography, demographics, technology. But it's also shaped by the decisions of specific people at specific moments. And at Teutoburg, individual choices mattered enormously. Arminius chose to rebel. He could have remained loyal to Rome, built a career in the imperial system, become a wealthy and honored provincial leader. He chose a different path and changed history. Varus chose to ignore the warning. Segestes told him about the conspiracy. Varus dismissed the information. That single decision, that moment of misplaced trust, led directly to the disaster. Tiberius chose to end the Germanic campaigns. Germanicus wanted to continue. Tiberius said no. That decision established the Rhine as the permanent frontier. At each of these moments, different choices were possible. Different choices would have produced different outcomes. The history we know is not the only history that could have happened. This is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us how contingent our world is, how much of what we take for granted depends on decisions made by people long dead. Empowering because it reminds us that decisions matter. The choices we make, individually and collectively, shape the future in ways we can't predict.